The Nuts and Bolts of Writing, Season 2, a podcast where we talk about literature, the ins and outs of writing, and how to actually start writing.
Hello everyone, I am and Roveleh, one of the co-hosts of the Nuts and Bolts of Writing. Today, I will be interviewing writer Ryan Keating. 4 of his poems have appeared in our literary magazine, The Unconventional Courier, namely Evading Time, Darkle, Enzo, and This Weird Garden. Ryan Keating is a writer, pastor, and winemaker on the Mediterranean island of Cyprus. His work can be found in publications such as Saint Katherine Review, Ekstasis Magazine, Amethyst Review, Macrina Magazine, Fathom, Vocivia, Roi Fainéant, and Miras Dergi, where he is a regular contributor in both English and Turkish. Hello, Ryan, and welcome to the Nuts and Bolts of Writing.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's wonderful to have you here and to be able to discuss literature and other topics with you today because I have a lot of questions. Your art and your life seem very interesting. So I know that you live in Cyprus right now. Could you tell us more about your connection with Turkey and with North Cyprus?
Yeah, I have lived in Cyprus for 6 years, and you may know that Cyprus is a divided island. There are essentially 2 entities on the island. So the Republic of Cyprus in the south, which is Greek-speaking, and the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus in the north, the Turkish part. That's where I live. And most of the world doesn't recognize diplomatic the autonomy or the existence of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. They just think of this part of the island as occupied territory. So it's a very disputed and controversial part of the world. And that's the part of Cyprus that we live in, and part of the reason that we live in this part of Cyprus, Turkey, between 2006 and 2016 in Turkey, because of the humanitarian work that we were doing there, which was seen by some of the authorities in Turkey to be a threat, particularly because I was also leading a church in Turkey, and I'm a Turkish speaker, and we had an active program feeding refugees, which was also politically sensitive at the time in 2016. And I was a PhD student in philosophy of religion at Ankara University's divinity school. So I was the only non-Muslim student in the divinity school, which also was somewhat controversial and attracted attention. So when there was an attempted coup that failed in 2016, the government instituted an OHAL, a state of emergency, which allowed them to suspend due processes and make it easier to deport people that they just didn't want in the country. And unfortunately, I was high on that list. So I was deported in 2016, and we came to North Cyprus as a family for that reason. I'm here with my wife and 4 kids, and we all speak Turkish, and we are very familiar with Turkish culture. I've been traveling to Turkey for most of my life, and it was a natural place for us to come to when we couldn't be in Turkey.
Wow, that is really fascinating. Why did you choose North Cyprus in particular?
Well, there's no opportunity to speak Turkish really in the other part of Cyprus, and also there was a greater need here. And we when I was 16, I came to Turkey as an exchange student and learned to speak Turkish, and fell in love with Turkey and Turkish culture and a love for the people and the place. And that's really where my heart was, and the reason why I pursued my PhD studies in Turkey and living and working and serving in ministry in Turkey. And we wanted to continue to be able to serve in this part of the world when we weren't able to stay in Turkey any longer. And we had more cultural affinity to North Cyprus, already familiar with the language, but we also are very active on the other side of the island, where we are working toward and trying to model a kind of unity and reconciliation between the Turkish and Greek parts of Cyprus. And so my my wife teaches at a school on the Greek side of Cyprus, and my kids all go to that school, and we travel back and forth between the two sides of the island and developing relationships and encouraging people to get to know one another on both sides of the island.
I know that a poet's relationship with nature is a very strong one, and Mediterranean nature is truly exquisite. I've never been to Cyprus, unfortunately, but I've been to Greece and other parts of the Mediterranean shores, and it's really fantastic. Would you say that you are inspired by the nature in Cyprus? What inspires you particularly about Cyprus?
Yeah, very much. And a lot of my writing features the themes of the natural world around me, as is true for so many other writers. So I'm writing about the flamingos in Cyprus, and writing about the swallows in Cyprus, and writing about the sea, and some of that is also culturally influenced. So I've got one of my poems introduces a Turkish word called yakamoz. Turkish has a word for the reflection of the moon on the sea. It's a beautiful idea to have a special word for that called yakamoz. So yes, definitely influenced by the natural world of the Mediterranean around me.
That's really wonderful. I had no idea that they had a word for that, and it's amazing. I suppose it's because they have the sea in sight so much. So this is why they have more words related to the sea than other countries.
Yeah, that may be. And Turkish is also a literarily rich language. In fact, I write some of my poetry in Turkish.
Wow. How long did it take for you to learn Turkish so well to get to the level where you can actually create poetry in this language?
Well, I've been learning Turkish for 30 years now. I started learning Turkish in 1993, but I think I'm still learning English to the level that I could write poetry in it. And that's also true about my progress in Turkish. So I speak Turkish quite well, and I teach in Turkish, and I write in Turkish. But even after 30 years, my Turkish is not as good. It's not as natural as English, and so it takes a bit more work, a bit more striving, and considering, and then even consulting with an editor after I finish an article or a poem in Turkish to make sure I haven't said anything that's overly unnatural. So I speak Turkish, I write in Turkish, but it does require more work than my English writing does.
I see. I find that really interesting because I also write in a language that is not my first language, because I'm Romanian, and I've actually never written in Romanian anything. Yeah, I mean, I tried writing in Romanian, but a long time ago. I think in high school was the last time when I actually tried. So this is why I've heard a lot of people say it's not possible to write, to create good literature in another language than your native one. But I always disagreed. So I find it excellent that you've brought this up, and that you have talked about what it's like to create in a different language. Of course, for you, it's different because, of course, a lot of foreign writers write in English, but for someone who's a native speaker of English to write in a different language is more out of the ordinary. And I find it fascinating that you've managed to learn it so well and to actually feel in this language, right? Especially with writing poetry, you need to actually feel it. Right.
Yeah, that's right, and it requires a level of kind of natural ease and an emotional connection to the language, not just intellectual capacity in the language.
Right, exactly. How would you define ekphrastic poetry, and what is your approach to it?
I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about the distinction between ekphrastic poetry and other styles of poetry, because I think that just about everything that we write, if not everything that we write, is in some way inspired by something we've experienced in another realm of life. So every kind of writing is in some way a response, whether it's a response to a painting or a song or whether it's a response to an idea that I had because I drove by an olive tree. In some way, everything is ekphrastic, especially for somebody who thinks that the world is not just a random collection of atoms and particles, but the world itself bears evidence of design, of beauty, which is for me really not different from writing a poem in response to a Joni Mitchell song, which I've done as well, or writing in response to an Emily Dickinson poem, which I've done, or writing in response to an icon in the Barnabas Museum down the street from my house. So, ekphrastic poetry, if I was giving an answer on a test, I'd have to say that ekphrastic poetry is poetry written in response to another work of art. But I think that if you understand the world the way that I do, there isn't another kind of poetry.
I see. That was a really beautiful answer. So in a sense, everything is a work of art in the world around us.
That's right. Yeah, I think so.
I see. Yeah, that's really interesting. So what does depth mean to you, and how do you achieve it in your poetry?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I teach, and I teach theology, and I teach preaching, and I teach students who are looking to be prepared for ministry, and students who are preparing to be preachers or teachers themselves. And I often say to my students that depth in teaching or depth in preaching comes from reading. It comes from deeply absorbing something, what's in the text is deep. And sometimes there's a temptation for us to think that I've already gotten what's on the page. I already understand it, and now I need to figure out something to say about it. But if the struggle is to figure out something to say about it, you obviously have not yet absorbed it deeply. So you absorb, you read until it is no longer a struggle to determine what it is you want to say about it. If you're still at the stage of trying to figure out what can I possibly say about this, well, you probably haven't absorbed it very well or very deeply yet. So depth, I think, comes from absorbing. It comes from absorbing the world around you. It comes from absorbing the text in front of you, or standing long enough in front of that painting, or listening enough times to that song, reading enough times that passage. But also, I think in our culture, there is sometimes a confusion between depth and obscurity. That if it's clear, it isn't deep. In order for it to be deep, it's got to be obscure. It's got to be nearly incomprehensible, and that's unfortunate. My academically, my field is philosophy. I didn't come to poetry through studying literature. I came to poetry through studying philosophy. And in philosophy, there's the same temptation sometimes for philosophers to try to say something which sounds deep, but which lacks clarity. Of a bad philosopher. And I think it's probably the mark of a bad poet, too. That doesn't mean that we want to say very prosaically or in a very, very straightforward way everything can be said, but depth should come from building layers and not just from adding obscurity. So I want to add layers of meaning to a statement, be inspired by an image, say it in a way that inspires thinking about it again or thinking about it deeply, not because it's hard to understand, but because there are multiple layers. And that's what I want to add in writing something deep, especially poetically. I want to build layers, not just make it hard to understand so that the reader has to work harder, but rather put the work should be on the side of the writer to build something with layers, maybe because of the phrasing that conjures up another idea, or because the way that the language that I've used refers to some other kind of writing, or invites a perspective from an unexpected point of view. Rather than just adding obscurity to make something hard to understand, we want to add layers of meaning so that there's more to absorb. And the effort should be on the part of the writer, not just to throw in half phrases or incomplete thoughts so that the reader has to try to imagine what might be communicated when in reality there's no intentional layer of meaning on the part of the writer. I think it's our job as the writer to add those layers of meaning so that there's genuinely something to be discovered. Now, that certainly leaves open the possibility that different readers might take something different or might bring their own interpretive lens to a poem, but sometimes obscurity can be a cheap substitute for real depth.
I see that that's a really thought-provoking idea because I'm sure that this also reflects in the form of the poetry that you are writing, in the wording, maybe even the rhyme, the rhythm. So why do you think that your chosen form fits the themes of your poetry?
You know, I think I am still new enough at poetry that I would have a hard time describing my style of poetry. So I have intentionally worked at reading about and absorbing different kinds of poetry and have tried hard to exercise the poetic muscle to write in different kinds of forms. So sometimes I'm writing with a cadence or a rhythm and a rhyme scheme inspired by poets like Emily Dickinson, and sometimes writing sonnets or experimenting with other kinds of forms and numbers of syllables. I've got poems where I'm trying to make sure that each line has 7 syllables and each stanza has 7 lines, and that the stanzas are mirroring one another. So I don't think there is any one particular form that is better suited for the kind of depth that I'm describing that I aspire to. And I don't think also that there's any one particular form that that contains best the kinds of themes that I want to write about. So I think I'm probably still discovering what it means for a poem to be in the style of Ryan Keating.
I see. A lot of variation is really challenging for a poet, but I see that you are passionate about trying different rhythms and cadences and rhymes and forms. So, how do you choose when you set out to write a poem? How do you choose the form that you are going to write it in? Is it just the way that you feel it, the way that you hear it in your head, or is it premeditated as in now I want to try the sonnet form, the sonnet form?
Yeah, usually what happens is I have an idea that I want to express in a poem, and I get down the first couple of words or a couple of lines, and it seems like after a couple of lines, a kind of a form is suggested. It's kind of it wants to be a sonnet, or it wants to be a rhyming poem, or it wants to be free verse. And sometimes there are occasions when I intentionally set out to write a sonnet, or I set out to write a rhyming poem, or in some cases the content will suggest a kind of form. So when I wrote a poem about a Greek theological term called perichoresis, which is about the interrelatedness between the members of the Trinity and between the divine and human natures of Jesus. And so I wrote a poem in 2 stanzas, one that represented the relationship between Jesus and the Father and the Son in heaven, and one that represented the relationship between Jesus and the church on earth. And so those 2 stanzas mirrored each other, and I did that intentionally so that you'd have that kind of chiastic mirrored structure between the first and second stanza, which is mirroring the relationship between God and this world,
Mm-hmm.
between heaven and earth.
Okay, right. Wow, that's fascinating. I think that poetry is also a means of sort of negotiating the relationship of the lyrical self with divinity. And I know that spirituality is a very important part of your poetry and of your life as well. So how would you say that your spirituality influences your writing and your inspiration?
I think that there are many different ways to answer that question. As I alluded to earlier, I think that there is a God who is good and who is beautiful and who has made a world that reflects that goodness and beauty. So our creating is a participation in the goodness of God and in the beauty of God. It's a cooperation with what God is doing in the world. But then also, poetry is sometimes a wrestling with the dissonance. It's a wrestling with our inability to see, or the places where it seems like beauty and goodness are not evident. And so poetry that laments the suffering in the world, poetry that wrestles with difficult questions like the hiddenness of God, or the absence of God, or the absence of consolation, or that wrestles with difficult emotions. That also is a reflection of spirituality. And it's the way that, for example, the Psalms in the Bible, the Psalms, which are a book of poems, 150 of them in most of the ways that our Bibles are compiled today, and 150 Psalms that reflect the full range of emotion. So in some of the Psalms, David is expressing a response to the evident goodness of God, but in some of the Psalms, he's responding to the way that God sometimes feels distant. So he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Or he says, God, why do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? That perspective of spirituality that isn't afraid to wrestle with difficult questions, that isn't afraid to ask things that don't have clear answers, or that it's willing to express negative emotions like sadness, sorrow, even anger and frustration at God.
I see. So poetry is a way to explore a wide range of emotions when it comes to both divinity and to, existential topics in general, and also introspection, because in discovering divinity and exploring your relationship with it, you also explore yourself and not only the nature of divinity.
Yes, that's right. And the topic of God, and any topic that's related to God, is such a profound topic that it is best served by approaching it both philosophically and poetically. So many of my poems are about topics that I've explored or read about or written about in my philosophy life. So poems that explore topics like the omnipresence of God, God's being located in every place, or poems that express some element of God's timelessness and eternity. Poems that address, I have a poem called The Hiddenness of God, which is just about that very theme. Why is it that God does not seem more evident to us? So those are topics that are worth exploring philosophically, and we should do that, but they also are of the kind of depth that they're exploring poetically as well.
That's really fascinating to hear, and it's really out of the ordinary to hear such about your connection with spirituality and the way you put it into poetry, because not a lot of writers go into so much something that is so personal to them, and in a sense something that is so outside of the human being. Wow, so these were all fascinating answers that you've given. So I wanted to ask you to end this interview. Are there any projects that you are working on right now in terms of poetry and not only limited to poetry, because we have approached a lot of different topics connected to literature today?
Well, there's lots of things that I'm always I'm always working on at the same time. I own and operate a cafe here, and I roast coffee and make wine. So I'm always working on a recipe for something, and I'm always working on a poem. I've got I think like so many poets, I've got just my notes app on my iPhone is filled with unfinished poems and poetry ideas. Um, I can let me scroll through. So I've been just this morning I started working on a poem which is building on a metaphor from glass. Maybe you've heard sort of the cliche that glass. It's true, but it's sort of a cliche image. The glass is not ever completely a solid. It's always flowing. It's always in motion, but it moves really slowly. And sometimes emotional heaviness feels like that to me. I want it to flow faster in those seasons when we feel heaviness. Kind of likening that to dark glass flowing too slowly.
Wow.
And here's another one. I've got this for months. For months, I've had this idea in my head. I want to include the idea of the sound of a tooth on a towel in a poem. That's a very obscure idea, but the sound of a tooth on a towel. If you grow, for me, it conjures something really specific. I think it kind of made me a memory from going to public swimming pools or something. But the sound of a tooth on a towel, and I've tried it in like 3 different poems so far, and none of it has satisfied yet. But so I'm working on that too.
Wow, I'm really looking forward to that poem in particular because, yeah, it is conjuring a very strong emotion for me, but not a very pleasant one. So I'm really curious to see how it would sound put into words.
Yeah.
Wow.
I will share it.
That's excellent. Well, this was a fascinating conversation, and thank you so much, Ryan Keating, for sharing all these with us and for being here today on the Nuts and Bolts of Writing.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Rebecca. This was a pleasure to do. I really enjoyed being able to talk about my poetry.
That's excellent, and I hope that you are going to join us again with poems sent to our magazine with another interview sometime in the future when we have other interesting topics to discuss. So thank you again for the conversation, Ryan, and thank you everybody for listening.